afternoon, everyone, and welcome to SCM's 8th Annual Scottsdale Insiders Seminar. I'm Keith Martin, the publisher of Sports Car Market. Over the next hour, we're going to look at a segment of the market that I call affordable supercars. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the SCM team. They include Executive Editor Jeff Sabatini, our IT Manager Brian Baker, our Auction Editor Chad Taylor, Producer John Nickus, and our Technical Director Matt Strauss. Let's also recognize and thank presenting sponsor and our virtual host, Gooding & Company, along with Putnam Leasing. Now, for those watching this video presentation, there is, of course, an SCM subscription special. Go to sportscarmarket.com/Zoom and you get a 25% discount on the magazine and back issues for just $4.33 a month. Let's meet the distinguished panelists for today's seminar. Hans Wurl from Gooding & Company. Hello, Hans. Steve Serio from Bond Group. And Philip Richter from the Turtle Garage. Today, we'll be looking at 4 representatives from the affordable supercar segment: the Acura NSX, the Bmw M6, the Ferrari 360 Modena, and the Mercedes-Benz SL55 AMG. Before we begin the discussion of these, we call this the affordable supercar shootout. I'd like to say that these, by some measurements, are not supercars because they don't have 3,000 horsepower and $1 million price tags. They're a supercar to me because I've spent all of my life driving 4-cylinder Alfa Romeos with 86 cubic inch engines and 114 horsepower. Steve, when I first asked you to be a part of this, your response was, why are we talking about a bunch of used cars?
It's a nice selection of cars that you would be proud to drive. But being in retail, if somebody rolled up with any of these cars, they would be deemed just a nice, lovely thing. It's in my world, not to be snobby or witty.
Aren't these ultra high performance cars? Are they supercars? Where do they fit into the world of cars today?
They're not supercars. They're lovely things. They're advanced for the time, and not to be rude about it, but have been quickly outdated, but by countless models that have come afterwards. But there are things that you'd be proud to own any of them, and you'd have a thrill to drive any of them.
We're going to start with the Acura NSX with Hans talking about it. Hans, so the Acura NSX, I tested them when they came out, when they were brand new, and they were kind of fat butt looking things that weren't Ferraris. And we didn't think anybody would ever care about like a Honda Acura that had a little wing on the back. So What's happened with NSXs?
Yeah, I mean, the NSX is a great, I think, case study in it being, Honda's, it may not be their first halo car, but in modern generation, it's their first halo car. Honda obviously had a massive engineering background, and at the time was an absolute force in Formula One. And so I think they did a masterful job of utilizing that technology and that mystique that they had around their racing program at the time. And obviously, especially from a marketing standpoint, applying that to their first car that, was an early, adopter of the VTEC technology and everything with the engine. I think when it comes to enthusiasts, it's always been drivers that have been attracted to the NSX. And whether it was, Ayrton Senna being part of the development team, or the VTEC, or the really glowing media reviews, especially from driving enthusiast type, editors and journalists at the time, I think people really were, from day one, very, very attracted to the dynamics of the NSX. It was one of the first modern supercars to use aluminum construction, and really in a lot of ways it adapted kind of a Lotus-like Colin Chapman-esque, lightness to add performance, even though it was also very technologically advanced. So it's not surprising to me that that car has had staying power over time, because it followed nothing in the Japanese car realm, especially. And it was an absolutely revolutionary thing at the time. I was a junior in high school when the car debuted, and I remember thinking that was some, pretty hot stuff.
But Hans, if you had been, when you were a junior, if there had been a brand new Ferrari 328 and an Acura NSX sitting next to each other in the parking lot, wouldn't you have walked right by the NSX to the Ferrari?
Yeah, I may be a unique case, but no, not necessarily. I've never been a huge Ferrari guy, although I love Ferraris and as much as most people do. You know, it's hard to really bash Ferraris at all. But no, I've always been a genuine fan. Honestly, an NSX is something of a bucket list car for me. It's something I've driven but never owned. I can see them being, and we'll get into, I think, their inherent qualities a little more, but I can see it being a very, very fulfilling ownership experience from a reliability and servicing standpoint and things like that. And plus, the damn thing is good. And I like driving. I'm not a Concours guy. I don't like cars and coffee. I like to go on drives, and they're good. They are as good as anything in the era.
So, Steve, you sold collectible cars for a long time. Why were NSXs worth nothing forever?
Well, it's unfair, I suppose, to the car. Hans made a lot of great points. Having sold, when he mentioned Lotus, that was the height of probably, my Lotus business when the NSX came out, and I think the Lotus was more rewarding. The going from S4 to S4S to early V8. Lotus was really right at the top of their game with their 4-cylinder engine right before they went to the 8. And we used to get a lot of NSXs, relatively a lot, in trade. And the only gripe about the car, and it's really picayune at this point, was that, and David E. Davis didn't say this, but my mind goes to a quote from the period, and I'll give it to somebody like him. It might have been Gene Lindemuth at the time, who became Gene Jennings. You could put a monkey in an NSX and it could go 95 miles an hour safely and could probably drive it as good as a race car driver. And that was the only flaw with the car, is that it wasn't engaging enough for a lot of people in an oral sense and a tactile sense. And it's in retrospect, they did a genius thing. They made a beautiful car that didn't fall apart, that wasn't hard to maintain. I mean, the rear tires used to get lunched at about 3,000 miles, which was the biggest complaint because they were expensive. But my only gripe about the NSX was that it wasn't engaging. It was too easy to drive as a supercar. Now, having said that, that's exactly where supercars and great sports cars are today. A lot of them are just very easy to drive to 100 miles an hour, and you don't feel anything about it, which is why I personally like driving old slow cars fast, because it's more engaging and you have to be paying attention the whole time.
So, but Philip, let me ask you, Philip, is there a place for an NSX in your collection?
Not in my collection, because I tend to gravitate towards European cars. But I think one of the fascinating things about the NSX is, when it arrived, nobody was ready for this car. Nobody expected Honda to build something like this. Acura, obviously, but Acura dealers had sedans. They had the Legend. They had the Integra. This car was from another planet at that time. So the market kind of looked at this and didn't know what to do with it. Everyone I've ever asked who's had a lot of seat time in an NSX will tell you that it is a gentleman's car. It is so comfortable. It's so well engineered. It's wonderful to drive. I get Steve's point on it's a little bit like today, a modern Lexus. It cocoons you from the actual driving experience. This car was that far ahead of its time then. And you look at how long the production run of this car was as its initial design. It was in production forever until the new one came out 2-3 years ago.
So Hans, let's talk about value for a second. These cars, my recollection is they were $30,000 forever. I mean, a car that would have, say, 25,000 miles on them, they were worth nothing. Bring a Trailer recently sold one for over $200,000. Yeah. So tell me what's going on with these cars.
Yeah, I literally have that note right here next to me, Keith. They were worth about 30 grand for a decade. And for a lot of people, I think that they're getting their fair share, their fair shake now. as, you know, as a recognition of what they are. They're actually, and rarity is something I know in our business and my business, and is a tough word, but they're not that common, and especially a good one. And I actually think that searching for an NSX is actually pretty difficult to find the right car. I think that there's actually a lot of NSXs that still remain in either original or very early ownership. To allude to kind of what Philip was saying, there are a lot of people that find them, especially if you want to have a single car, to be a do-all supercar, sports car, or hobbyist car. And I think that there are a lot of them that are kind of locked away in long-term ownership. And that leaves you with, even though there are always, you know, 20 or 25 on the market at any time, it leaves you with some kind of ratty or refurbished examples. And so, like a lot of cars, when a really, really high quality example comes to either auction or just market privately, it can demand a premium. And I think we've seen that. But across the board, they're up roughly what, 75 to 100% from their bottom of being kind of $30,000 cars. And then if you find one with 1,200 miles in black, you know, with its original owner, you're going to have to pay up for it.
Is there another 100% left to appreciate?
I don't see any reason why you would be worried about depreciation or stagnation with NSXs at the current levels. I think if you paid $200,000 for one, you might have been chasing. But if you want to look at
that was a special situation, though. That was the limited edition, which was actually quite limited,
sure,
and very, very rare.
Yeah,
so I think that car was actually well bought.
It's a great point. Speaking about more, just, you know, let's take a first year or first 3 or 4 year car with average miles. I think, you know, if you buy a quality example and you pay a fair market value for it, I don't see there being, especially since it's a car from the 90s, there's still a lot of enthusiasm from that generation. It's not a pre-war Lincoln, right? It doesn't have a demographic that is going to not be sticking around and driving.
No, I think the guys that are finally, coveted them, you know, Hans, to your point about being in, what you said, junior high school when they came out, guys that are now your age, you're a little younger than me, are getting to the point where they're going, you know, I always wanted those. And that's always the key, you know, who's aging in, who's aging out. And Keith, I guess there's headroom in them. I loved the very first example. I think the original design was the cleanest, like anything else. You know, gewgaws add to it and they get a little bloated. NSX, you know, Acura did not make that car suffer that way. I hate the new one. There was so much hype around it and it kind of came out. It landed flat. And I think it's one of those cars that came out and a lot of people went, did that actually ever come out? Can I buy one? You know, there was a wait, there was a list, there isn't a list. Now there are too many of them. Now you can't find it. You know, it's one of those confusing issues with a new car where it kind of landed with a thud after, you know, Super Bowl commercials with Leno and Seinfeld. And then it just kind of fell on its ass. But I think there's headroom in it. I think it's a wise place to, you know, park some money. And then again, to Hans's point, I like driving, and it's what's better than going into your garage and knowing the thing's going to start. So,
well, Steve, that's a great point. I have a friend who owns one and drove it like a regular car. Never had a maintenance issue, never had a problem. Servicing was cheap. I mean, these are bulletproof, reliable Hondas. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Before we move on to the Modena 360, let's give this car a swagger rating. So 0 is like no swagger, and 10 is the max swagger. So on a scale of 0 to 10 swagger, Philip, what number do you give this car?
I give it a 7, a strong 7.
How about you, Steve?
Behind that, I'm a 5. I'm a high 4 going into a 5 because I've never turned my head.
No, Steve, not you personally, the car.
Yeah, no.
No. I mean, I give you a 5 all day long because you're my friend.
I have an F bomb here. See it? And don't make me drop it early. Okay, so, yeah, I'm still at a 5. I mean, it's nothing. You don't hear them coming down the street, then grab your attention, and you see one going past, and you go, "Ooh, what was that?" It was like there's an NSX. So I think. The big pluses are it's a 10 for reliability and dependability. It's probably a 7 for rarity at this point, and it's a 5 for swagger.
Hans, where are you?
I'm a 7 as well. It's not the kind of car that turns heads, and so maybe swagger. It's a high score for swagger factor, but I think it's a thinking. I think it's a thinking man's buy. I really do. I think it's an enthusiast car, and it's not a pile of crap like a lot of sexy stuff is. And there's something to be said for that.
I think if you had a 500E or an E500 and an NSX in your garage, you'd have two very different things that would always work and always bring you plenty of joy.
So Hans, I've asked you to be the advocate for the Modena 360. I worked for Ron Tonka and Gran Turismo the last years of the 328, 88, 89. And I remember when the Modena 360 came out, it was, first the 348 came out, which we all called an MR2 with strakes on the side. And then the 355, okay. But then the 360 was like a spaceship from another planet. It just kind of brought Ferrari back into the modern world. But it's been around for a while now. So Hans, tell us about your feelings about the 360.
I think in that generation leading up, like you were saying, to the 360, Ferrari did a really good job of differentiating between those models. The 308, the 328, that's obviously just a very small level of evolution. The 348, for all of its flaws, and there are lots, was a step forward style and architecture wise. And then the 355 was really different from the 348. And again, like you said, the 360 was another big step. I have always been a fan, but I want to say that I don't know that the 360 Modena has aged quite as well as I would have liked. A lot of cars become definitely, it's like if you walk into a house and it's got the Formica cabinets with the oak pull handle, you're like, that's a house from the 80s. Some cars are a little more timeless. And while the 360 is pretty, I don't necessarily think that the styling has aged necessarily as well as I would have liked. Driving those cars, I've only driven one, and I could go on, and Keith, you know this about me, but I don't do single clutch flappy paddle gearboxes, as Jeremy Clarkson would call them. And the only one I ever drove was an automated manual. So it wasn't my greatest experience, but they do have a lot of Ferrari character. All of that oral and tactile excitement is definitely evident with the 360. And I think they deserve their place in Ferrari's pantheon of successful models. They sold a lot of them. They were very universally appealing. They drive really, really well. The performance level still, they were 400 horsepower at the time, is very high. But I want to call out the Challenge Stradale, because I think the Challenge Stradale, as can be, and Steve, usually I'm with you, where you say the first iteration of something is always kind of like the peak of a model. But I think for the 360, it was the Challenge Stradale. And that's maybe something of an easy statement to make because it was the most performance oriented. But even just the wheel design and the grills and the tricolore stripe and everything, I think it stood out.
So I'd like to say, Hans, you used oral and tactile excitement. Those are words that none of the three of you used in context with the NSX.
Yeah, I did.
Steve mentioned it a little bit, but no, the NSX it definitely is a more subdued experience, but it knows how to, unlike Ferrari's a little bit, it knows how to shut up and will shut up when you tell it to.
So let me ask Steve. Steve, what was it like to maintain these cars and take care of them?
Well, it's funny. You just were reading the thought bubble, the negative thought bubble that was coming out of my head. We serviced a lot of those cars here, and my eyes would light up when they'd come in, because there's nothing like servicing when you're on the receiving end of the money. A 360 or a 430 that has been sitting in someone's garage, being pampered with a soft cloth with bright lights on it on its pedestal because it's a Ferrari. The brake systems, unless they're flushed regularly, they turn to super glue. The rubber inside the cockpit tends to go to hell. The transmission, which Hans doesn't like, which I abhor, and I would never own one of these cars with a flappy paddle setup, can get out of adjustment. And they're horror shows to service if they haven't been driven. And I don't think the value, the cost per mile is extraordinary compared to all the other cars we're talking about, which, you know, I feel like I'm on the Masked Singer here trying to unmask, you know, good, bad, and indifferent about things. And it's awful. And I think the 328, as we talked about in the past, was a robust car at the end of an era that worked perfectly. It wasn't cheap to maintain, but was a whole lot cheaper to maintain than the cars that came after it. The 348, I've got nothing nice to say about. I like the looks of the 355, but that had its whole litany of serviceability issues as well, from camshafts to electrical problems. And then the 360 was revolutionary in its look, but I remember driving one for the first time and I thought, get me out of the car with these crazy paddles. It does nothing for me. And
let me jump over to Philip here. Philip, you're a German car guy. How does a Ferrari 360 Challenge fit into your collection?
You know, it doesn't. And I think, you know,
are there any circumstances under which what would cause you to pull the trigger and buy one? Give me the exact circumstances.
You know, I think if it was a car that had the right history, right ownership, and was a market failure, and that I could buy a Ferrari at an incredible bargain price. But I think the issue, Keith, is what Hans nailed. It's not a timeless design. When you put this car next to a Maranello, there's just no question. A 6-speed gated Maranello is a whole nother league than this car, in my view. As aesthetically, the Maranello will always be a Ferrari that has the creases, the lines, the excitement, the stature, and the beauty. This car, I think it probably looked great at that moment in time, but it hasn't aged well. So I wouldn't buy it.
That's right. So let me ask you, gentlemen, about the swagger factor. All right. 0 is none and 10 is all. Where do you poke the 360, Hans?
I mean, for me, it's a 5, probably. You know, the bigger one thing I just want to throw in, seems like half the 360s in the world have horrible aftermarket wheels on them, don't they? They all have like Forgiatos or something on them, and there's a lot of stereotypes that I like to avoid when it comes to the cars and their owners, but that's one that I can't avoid. I'm pretty sure you could prove that with science.
Where do you say, Philip? Swagger factor.
Well, look, it is a Ferrari. Let's not forget that. So its swagger factor is high just in the fact of it. You know, it is a Ferrari. So I would say I'm a little higher, probably in the 6 range.
Okay, and Steve?
Yeah, I'd even give it, you know, between a 6 and a 7. So just on swagger alone, in the right color with the right exhaust note with original wheels on it. It'll turn heads. I still wouldn't want one for free, but it's got that panache. And to Philip's point, it's aged terribly in a shape, especially compared to the 550.
Yeah.
Before we leave this car behind, let's talk value for a second. So these cars have really depreciated. But let's talk about 6-speed cars. 6-speed coupes or open cars. Hans, where do you peg those cars today?
Like anything, you just need to, you know, anybody who's shopping for something like that needs to buy, you know, the most desirable setup. And that would be, in this instance, a 6-speed car in the right color with the right history and everything. Honestly, Keith, I don't have the 360, you know, price ranges pinned off the cuff and probably should. But as with anything, you know, that is the setup. You got to go for something that is kind of, you know, quintessential, and it's got to be a manual.
What do you say, Steve?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's funny. The last one of these I bought was it was a 6-speed car, and it had to be used as a donor to build something else. So it was kind of a funny situation. So is it worth the 80, 90, 100 grand you got to throw at one? I don't think so. I mean, I think they're headed nowhere but down because of the cost of servicing the car versus the bang you're getting for the buck involved. And I would rather throw my money at a 308, which is at this point dead slow of an automobile, but still a nice looking thing, and especially a 328 if you could find one in an off color that's a coupe. Yeah, I don't see the $100,000 being a smart place to spend the dough.
Let's move on now to the BMW M6. Steve, are you going to take the lead on this?
Yeah, I when you first sent that, I thought, I read it and I'm thinking, are we referring to the M6 from the Chris Bangle days, where I think I would have looked like somebody storming the Capitol trying to get Chris Bangle fired from BMW with what I don't think he did to that, to that company. I love the old.
Steve, I'm going to interrupt you. I was at the Detroit Auto Show and Chris Bangle was giving a talk, and he said the problem with Americans is they're not sophisticated enough to understand my designs.
Of course, and apparently he's taking Germans to be uneducated fools or something. That's a hell of a quote. We're not smart enough to understand the flame design, except when we look at it, we're too busy puking, I think is why we weren't smart enough to understand it. Even the Germans don't like them. Anyway, back to the point. I'm glad we weren't talking about that series, 6 Series car, because I've got nothing good to say about him. I loved the M6 and the 635 following up the 633 in the 80s. I mean, I was always a fan of the 5 Series cars. I owned the first gen M5 when it came out. It was, a disaster for sales, and they were giving the cars away essentially. I loved it, hand built. And then when the 6 Series car came out, I thought, that whole shark nose shape, the 2+2 usability, BMW is onto something here. And I think I stopped paying attention to BMW right after the 6 Series car. The M6 from memory was sort of $60,000, 60-ish, because the M5 was 52.5 and most of them sold for 35. I think there was a strong following for that car, and I had plenty of people ask me to find West Coast examples that weren't driven in the winters in the Northeast when the car was probably 5 years old. And I think the equivalent rare NSX and gated late 360 is an Alpina 6 Series car. I had a Diplomat's car here that was a B9. I don't think it was a B10. It was a B9 Alpina. And it was all blacked out. It was an 1981 early example, and it was one of the best BMWs I ever had the pleasure of owning and driving. I absolutely loved the 6 Series cars, and I think they've aged well, and they have skyrocketed in value in the last, really 5 to 10 years ago. They really started getting some steam, and with the advent of Bring a Trailer, and so we have to have a contest for a better word than young timer. This to me is that young timer car where the guys who might want a 911, might want some kind of special Benz, German car collectors should have a 6 Series car. I'm a big fan of those cars.
So Philip, you were recommending that I look at a late model M6 because they're a 500 horsepower car, and you can get a depreciated car for about 30 grand. Are they a value at that price?
We're talking about the Bangle car?
No,
not the 24.
Yeah, the late model one.
Yeah, well, we got on that road, Keith, because of you were talking about buying a high performance, high horsepower car that was fully depreciated. And that certainly checks all those boxes. This car is a whole nother level. To Steve's point on valuation, I owned an E24 M6 that had 1,700 original miles on it, 1988 car. And I owned it for 10 years. I never got to enjoy it because I didn't want to put miles on it, which is against your religion, Keith. But I did at age 17 drive an E24 M6 from New York to Palm Beach as a 17-year-old. And that changed my life. That car at speed was like nothing I've ever driven before or since. It's such a great car. But to tell you how the market has changed on these cars. Now, granted, mine was an ultra low mileage 100-point car that had been maintained every year. I got an unsolicited email over my blog site, Turtle Garage, and this individual said, "I'd like to buy your M6." I said, "It's not for sale." They said, "Everything's for sale." I said, "Well, I can't sell it." And I said, "If I did, it'd be a stupid number." They said, "Show me your stupid number." And I mean, the car ultimately, I had to sell it. I didn't want to. And it ultimately sold for a value that was pretty competitive with a large house in Cleveland, Ohio. And it's stupendous. But the demand for these cars were all driven, used up. Steve, how many do they import into the U.S. in 86 or 87, 88? Like,
well, only hundreds. I don't think there were thousands. I mean, I think at that point BMW was still getting going.
And they do not do well in the elements. They fade.
No.
The leather doesn't do well. The gauges don't do well. So, if you have a good example of this car with under 10,000 miles, you name your price. And that's what I did. And I was blown away by the transaction. I've never, ever expected that.
So, Philip, what's the swagger factor on this car?
I think it's extremely high. But the swagger is going to depend on who's in the audience to respect and understand what this car is, because a lot of people don't. There's not a huge following for this car because it's a very niche car. But I'm going to say, as an enthusiast, if you're driving into a room of enthusiasts of our demographic, it's a 9 to 9.5.
Hans?
Yeah, I think that, these cars are highly underrated by people that don't quite appreciate them because they haven't experienced them. I think that this generation of M car in the late 80s is literally the point at which, barring a few other things, but this is the point at which BMW started to slowly fall off of its key, features, which, were that the cars were incredibly capable, robust, hand-built, and they drove like absolute dreams. The M6, the M5 were remarkable cars and remain so. And I mirror Philip's thoughts about they're not handling the elements well. It's another car that it's pretty hard to find a really good example of these days, and there's a lot of crap out there. So I think swagger-wise for me, they're very high as well.
I would also just add that, while the 635s were good cars, they're just used cars now. It has to be an M, because the motor on this car just takes it to a whole nother level. It's a beautiful engine. It's powerful even by today's standards. So, the regular normal 6 Series is not a collectible car. It's a usable car.
Steve Serio, what do you know about the maintenance on these cars?
This really falls under the category of do not look for a bargain car without great paperwork and any kind of deferred maintenance. You want to buy the absolutely best one that you can as an M car only. If you're really, really lucky and you can go after that, needle in the haystack as an Alpina built car, you've really got something. You'll own the car for the rest of your life if it's a well-maintained example. And that doesn't mean 10, 20,000 miles. That means buy one with 75,000 or 100 miles on it, but 100,000 miles on it, but get one that has been serviced to death and by a BMW specialist. And the swagger factor, to Philip's point, in the right crowd, I'd rather have that so far than the other two cars we've talked about. And I'm up in the 9s for this car, especially in a right color and a stick. Again, do not fall under do not buy the automatic because it's cheaper, because it's not going to be nearly as fun as the stick.
Well, Philip, the last car that we're going to talk about is the SL55, and it's your fault that I own one of these. And in fact, it's your fault that I fell down the rabbit hole of depreciated late model cars. Because what I'm finding out with these cars is that I spent $6,000 for a pair of camshafts for one of my Alphas. And I bought the SL55 for $24,000, and I probably paid $2,000 too much for it. I forgot to ask if it actually had 2 keys. And somebody said, if you can't afford to buy the second key for $1,000, you shouldn't buy the car in the first place.
Yeah.
But so, Philip, I kept looking at SL500s. I was looking for an automatic, and you kept saying SL55. And I said, Philip, SL500. And you kept saying SL55. You were just You pestered me. So what's that all about?
So the reason, Keith, why I recommend it so strongly to Keith, the SL55, is because I owned an SL500 R230 for about 4 years. It was a fantastic car. I traded it for an SL55, which it's an entirely different level of automobile. It's way more athletic. It's way more powerful. It's way more fun to drive. And, you know, I differ a little bit with Steve on his point about how, you know, these cars, you know, are kind of left in the dust of modern cars today. I mean, this is a car that back then had satellite radio, tons of aluminum, airbags all over on the bolster, on the door, obviously driver passenger, pop-up roll bar when it senses rollover situation, ventilated seats. It even had, some of them even had Distronic, which is an early forerunner of autonomy, where it would hold its distance. Back in 2003, you could order this car with Distronic. It also had about 500 horsepower, depending on the year they got. The horsepower went up in later years. So this is the ultimate modern roadster, and you get a hand-built AMG engine, and they're practically free today relative to what they are. And I owned mine for 5 years. I put about 12,000 miles on it. It never once had a mechanical issue, ever.
Hans, what do you think of them?
I'm not a big fan of that body style of SL in particular. So if we're talking about that, that's the only thing I'll say. Otherwise, I love them. And absolutely anything from that generation that got that supercharged 5.5 liter V8 was utterly transformed. And AMG also really came into their own in the dynamic department when it came to suspension tuning and everything. And then the styling, apart from the SL, I think in that generation was also just really, really great. So I've always been a huge fan. A little side, I was lucky enough to meet Wolfgang Zimmermann, who was the designer of that engine, and on a Mercedes media trip years ago. And he kind of ran down how he had clean sheet, full autonomy to do what he wanted within a few kind of confines. And it was a no holds barred approach to that powertrain and that engine. And he was incredibly proud and rightly with how robust it was. I mean, there are stories of that powertrain, even in a neglected sense, going for high levels of mileage. People put supercharger pulleys on them and get huge amounts of power. So I'm a massive fan of those generation of supercharged AMG Mercedes.
Is this a collectible car with a future?
I think one with, 6,000 miles on it in black that's original ownership. Sure. It's a sliding scale from there. I think it really mirrors that the 6 Series and M6, dynamic we just talked about, where, like you're saying, an SL500 is kind of just a car, and the AMG version is something more and probably has an air of collectability about it. I don't necessarily know that people will be clamoring in 20 years for 90,000 mile versions of this, like they are with, let's say, like an E500. But it's possible.
There's another factor here that's interesting to your point, Hans. The SL500 or even the SL550, which was built in the later series of the R230, they're just cars. The SL65, which is the V12 biturbo edition, is not that desirable. It's a lot heavier than this car. It doesn't have the athleticism, and it's not as much fun to drive. And I've done some seat time in that too. The other thing that's great about the R230, this was the very end of Bruno Sacco's reign. Bruno Sacco's fingerprints are all over this car. And if you're a Mercedes aficionado, he was arguably the greatest designer of the modern era at Mercedes-Benz. So this is his swan song, which is to me why it's also partly an attractive design.
Steve, what do you think of this car?
It's a very easy answer. It's a sweet spot car. It really is better than, I'll go even back to the SL600, the SL300, cars that came after that, the 65. I have a dear friend who's an original owner of one of these cars, and it's got about 10 or 12,000 miles on it. It's brand new. I can't wait for him to be tired of it so I can take it off his hands. I do think it runs the slight risk with all of that advanced technology in it that you don't want one of those things to break, because it may, if the car is a $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 car, I mean, in really great condition, if some of that electronic hardware goes phooey, it's going to bite you in the ass. It may get a little edgy looking, wonky looking in time. Tough to say. It's not going to be a 280 SL from 1971. It's not going to be a 3.5 cab. It's not going to be one of those things. But I think it's out of all the cars we're talking about, it's the biggest value for money. I think it's really a great first, fun car for somebody that's looking for a nice car to drive. It's just the right car engine wise. The whole AMG performance thing went all the way through to Aston Martin Vantage today. Those are AMG motors, and it's a cousin to that. It started back then and really did have legs.
What's the swagger factor, Steve?
-1. There's no swagger to it. There's class to it. There's beauty and style. You'd be proud to drop your wife off at the valet in the restaurant, but I don't think there's sadly it's kind of the best car of this group in many ways, and it has no swagger.
Philip, what do you say?
Yeah, I would agree with Steve. It's low on the swagger scale. It's very high on the driving scale, the performance scale, the reliability scale. But swagger, no one's going to know the difference between an SL55 AMG and an old SL500 that was driven around Palm Beach, for its whole life. It's the same car optically, so not much.
Hans, what do you say?
I'm more or less with the guys. I think that there's a sort of allure to the subtlety that AMG kind of enacted, their styling changes. I like the fact as an enthusiast that I can spot them based on whether it's wheels or maybe a front balance or something like that, or badging. But yeah, swagger, not a lot.
Well, let me tell you my experience with my SL55. It's a car where people say to me, "Oh, your doctor retired and you bought his car?" And I say, "No, come over here and look see where it says AMG right over. Here, I've got a Fresnel that enlarges, and I hold it in front of the AMG, and I say, come on, let me show you the AMD dance, and we can walk around the car and do all sorts of fun." And they just leave.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's your dentist's car, not your doctor's car.
It's true.
Difference.
Yeah.
So dentists usually went from a Z8 to a SL55.
Yeah. So what I'd like to talk about briefly here, this has been my own education as I've learned about these late model cars. I have grown up with cars, as Steve, you said it earlier, driving a slow car fast. Cars that really beat me to death, and I loved every minute of it. Early this spring, I took the SL55 to Montana twice, put about 5,000 miles on it. I never once worried about the oil temperature gauge or the water temperature gauge. I put the top down whenever I wanted. And I thought to myself, this is actually pretty nice, So I'm wondering if I am maturing out of the need to beat myself to death, and I can buy for $25,000 a 500 horsepower car and have a hell of a good time. What does that say about all the cars that we've taken so much time and money to restore that are pretty difficult to drive these days?
I think they become a thing you add to the garage when you don't want. I think the older cars might become more event cars, but I'm completely biased in the cars that I own versus all the things I've had over the years. I've gone down the slippery slope of almost everything in my garage is German, because it works. It's comfortable. I can get parts for it. They're liquid. But I would not trade either of my Speedsters or for that matter, my GTI with a Callaway turbo now, I think, or my Volkswagen Thing. Those are all old tech, low, my wife's 912. All of those cars have a place alongside one of these, which is, to me, is one of the 911s that I have that are more modern, or the 500E, or, pick one. And I'm not trying to be grandiose about everybody should have 10 cars. But if you had a 356 coupe, there's a use for that alongside one of these 4 cars, and you'll have just as much fun. But if it's raining out, or if it's 30 degrees out, or if it, I dare say even, it's torrential or snowing or something, you want a modern, fun car to be in for safety. If you're going to do an event where you're going to find some weather, or whether you're going to go, Keith, to your point, if I'm going to drive to New York City or to Montreal or to upstate New York, I'm not taking my Speedster anymore. And I used to do that. I'm taking something that has got Bluetooth and Sirius radio and 500 horsepower. That's going to get me back and forth quickly and comfortably. I think that's the difference. I think there's room in if you have space and you have the means, I think there's plenty of room to add one of these cars to your garage and not replace anything.
Hans, does a 30-year-old buyer agree with Steve Serio?
Oh, I would hope not. No.
I gotta hope not.
Yeah. No.
I hope not.
Kidding, of course. I don't
want anybody to agree with me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a 46-year-old guy, so I don't know about the 30-year-old buyer. But look, I think that there's an argument to be made that competence is not necessarily everything it's cracked up to be. We treat these cars, as pieces of our hobby. And what we want out of our time driving our cars at times, I don't want to say we want adversity, but we want character. We want a different experience. And I think that, look, I have a 74 GTV that I'm thinking about selling right now. And I've thought about maybe I should get a 997. I have an older 911. Maybe it'd be cool to have old and new, but I can't imagine not wanting to drive my older cars. Just because the new 911 is more competent, and it might be fun to have something like Steve says for certain environments. But part of the reason that we love to drive old cars is the way they make us feel when we drive them. And that can't be replaced by newer machinery. So I mirror his thoughts on, I think one of each is an ideal thing. If you have to have one car, I guess you need to look at things that can tick all boxes for you. And maybe some of the cars on our list that we've talked about today, I think a few of them get pretty close. There's a few other cars that come to mind on all other budget ranges, things like Mazda Miatas, other almost any generation of 911, depending on how vintage you want your experience to be, are all very, very competent cars that are fun to own. So, harkening back to what was said earlier, it's, as collectors come into the marketplace at earlier and earlier ages, whatever their experiences were when they were children, whatever enthused them when they were just getting into cars is usually what they're going to gravitate towards. And I think there's a selection of things that you could say would give you a great experience, either vintage or newer.
So Philip, where are you on collectors who are in their 30s and 40s on cars from the 60s and 70s to cars from the 90s and the 2000s?
I think the easy answer is that they're just not interested, and they're going to demographically be in a different place, and therefore they're not going to want those cars. They're not going to want to drive them. There's no interest. I don't think that's entirely true. And I know several enthusiasts who are, of that age group that are actually very interested in cars from an older era. They're interested in driving them. They like the analogness of them. And I don't think it's a blanket statement that it would be something that demographic would just turn their head away from completely. I think that there are actually younger people out there that want to fiddle with old cars, drive old cars, have a leaky roof, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so gentlemen, we're going to wrap this up, and I'm going to ask you each for a choice. Before I do that, I'm going to do another advertisement for Sports Car Market. Go to sportscarmarket.com/Zoom. You get a 25% discount on the magazine, 1 year of back issues, digital access. This presentation has been brought to you by Gooding & Company and Putnam Leasing. This is the 8th annual Sports Car Market Insider Seminar. Gentlemen, one last question. You're going to pick one of these cars we talked about. I want to know which car it is and what the trigger point is for the sweet spot. How much you think you'd have to pay to get a right car. Which car would it be? I'm going to start with you, Hans.
For me, it's the NSX. And that's probably based more than anything, maybe on nostalgia. It's tough to pick that over an M6. I've had a lot more seat time in M6s. I'm familiar with them, maybe more than I am the Acura. And I think I'd be looking at a car with 80,000 miles on it that's got rock chips on the front. So hopefully I'd get away for 50,000 bucks.
Okay, Steve?
I'm going with the SL. It would fit in my collection. I just think it's a great bang for the buck. I've been there with the M series cars. I'm not diminishing them. I've just done it. I've never gravitated towards the NSX. I'm going to give Hans that as a Christmas gift. And the Ferrari, I wouldn't want one in my garage because I wouldn't want to maintain it. I think the SL is the biggest bang for the buck. And 25, I think if you go $25,000, $35,000, you're ending up a car that you'll keep for 10 years, because if you're paying up for one, I mean, Philip, am I right in the price point?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you can buy them in the 20s. You could buy the best one in the world for the high 30s. And that's a car with I bought mine 7 years ago, and it had 8,000 miles on a one-owner car, and I paid 38 for it back then. I mean, that's a lot. It's not a lot of money for the performance capability. The R120, the R230 SL55 has a theoretical top speed of 200 miles an hour if you had the right rubber on it. So
what the officer told me was that if I'd been going 4 miles an hour faster, he would put my car on the flatbed.
Well done.
Yeah.
So thank you, Philip Richter, Hans Wurl, Steve Serio, thank you, Matthew, the technical director, for putting this together. Thanks for helping us today in these times that have been very complicated. We thought it was important to have a seminar and to share your thoughts with all the enthusiasts out there. And Hans, I'm going to ask you to agree with me here that there's a tremendous amount of pent up enthusiasm and desire to buy cars. And as soon as we get this whole situation worked out, I think we're going to see a wave of buying.
Yeah, we at Gooding & Company are still constantly in contact with our clients. We're starving, just like everyone else is, for the physical and face-to-face interaction that we've all been missing. We've obviously delved in with our geared online sales. Those have been, really, really successful. They've been new and fun, and it's continued engagement with our sellers and buyers. But we agree. There's certainly pent-up demand, and we're certainly looking forward to seeing people face-to-face as soon as possible, hopefully this summer.
Thanks again to Gooding & Company and Putnam for sponsoring this. Sportscarmarket.com/Zoom for your subscription special. And all of the three of you, thank you for spending your time with us today. Stay safe.